Welcome to Two Truths, where we explore controversial topics in religion, philosophy, and history from at least two different perspectives. I'm Dr. Darren Iammarino, and today we're going to be talking about atheism. And more accurately, we're going to take a look at this claim. Most atheists haven't actually earned the title. Now, what does that mean? We need to look at definitions for what atheism is first. Here's two. A person who does not believe in the existence of a God or any gods, plural. This next one is coming from the American Atheist website. Atheism is one thing: a lack of belief in gods. Right? Now, here's what I mean by saying that most atheists, maybe not most, but many atheists have not actually earned the title. It's because the arguments that are typically brought forth against theism are really against Western monotheistic forms only, like the Abrahamic religions, okay? They're pretty much arguing against Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and what the orthodox viewpoint is of God in those traditions. Now, that will require a look at a little bit of a definition for what God typically is understood as, and I go over this in way more detail, by the way, in one of my other videos where I'm talking about proof or different proofs for God. Omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent. So really a lot of omnis there, right? Which is just means all, okay, in Latin. So the idea is that like God is the supreme, right? The ultimate, the all powerful, all knowing, all loving, and present everywhere. It's those omni terms for defining God that are going to really get both sides, I think, in the end, in trouble, okay? So we'll have to get back into like looking at some of these arguments in a second. But before we do that, I want to briefly address some maybe confusion between terms. Atheism, we've had our definition, but what about agnosticism? Right? A lot of people claim that they're agnostic. So what's the difference between being an atheist or an agnostic? Well, an atheist is, of course, a much stronger position because you're willing to more boldly assert that you do not believe, right, in the existence of a God or any gods whatsoever. An agnostic, if you break the word down, is basically saying that I don't have any special revealed knowledge that would give me the ability to come down definitively on one side or the other. There's different words for knowledge, okay, in Greek. So agnostic, if you really are breaking it down, it is saying that like I don't have any personal or like special revelation, any lived experience that's going to sway me heavily on one side or the other, but I'm open to being, right, maybe persuaded one way or the other, and I do have some interest or care in the question of whether or not there is a God or gods. Okay? Now, if you're like, I just don't care at all about this entire question, could care less if there are gods or not. Well, that's where the word apathy comes in. And you've got apatheism or apatheism, okay? Apathy in there. Someone who just doesn't even care about the question at all, right? Now, with some of these things in place, I want to read an interesting quote from arguably the most well-known and famous new atheist member, Richard Dawkins, who wrote a very popular book called The God Delusion. And what happened is he had the hardcover, right, come out first, and then the paperback came out. And in sort of the preface to the paperback edition, he wanted to answer or address some of the questions and concerns that people had, right, about the book. And that's where you'll find this. Okay, so again, it's from the paperback version of The God Delusion. And here is a quote, and it's starting with someone asking him, right, a question or making a statement about his beliefs. You always attack the worst of religion and ignore the best. You go after crude, rabble-rousing chancers like Ted Haggard, Jerry Falwell, and Pat Robertson, rather than sophisticated theologians like Tillich or Bonhoeffer, who teach the sort of religion I believe in. Now, Dawkins is going to respond to that. And here's what Dawkins has to say. If only such subtle, nuanced religion predominated, the world would surely be a better place, and I would have written a different book. The melancholy truth is that this kind of understated, decent, revisionist religion is numerically negligible. So that's a a nice basically way of saying I don't even need to address it because there aren't enough people that even know about it or care about it. There's a lot to be said here. One, we could certainly take issue with this claim that it's numerically negligible. Maybe in terms of only addressing the two people named, Tillich or Bonhoeffer, but even that, there's a lot of people that are interested in them. But if you bring up these other alternative forms of theism, we're going to be going into a lot of them today. For example, process theology and the works of Alfred Whitehead, or open theists. There are a lot of different forms of theism that wouldn't be falling under some of the critiques that Dawkins is going to have. Now, that's one point. Another thing is, let's not forget that the title, I have his book here, right? You can see it, but it's quite reflected. The God Delusion in the title. It doesn't say the Abrahamic religion delusion or the delusion of Western monotheisms or something like that. The title says the God Delusion. Now, maybe he didn't pick the title, you know, or maybe the publisher did, I don't know. But still, that's the title that they all went with. And it's pretty presumptuous to assume that you have covered all these different forms of theism. I mean, right off the bat, he's essentially saying that he's not, because they're numerically negligible, which, again, I take complete issue with that. But this kind of will speak to my point that a lot of people that are atheists, for one, they might be anti-theists, or as I would call it, a-Judeo-Christians. They're against the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic understanding of God and the religious dogma that you find in those religions. But there's a huge jump between going from saying, like, I don't believe in these religions and I have successfully refuted them through science and philosophy, and then saying the whole spectrum of possible theisms, right, are also negated just because I think I've dealt with this one type, right? That's really a fallacy. You can't make that leap from that one or two cases to all other forms, right, of theism that are out there. And that's kind of what I want to, dive into here a little bit. For one thing, though, let's look at the main argument just for a brief minute. The main argument that you're typically going to get from all these different books on atheism, for sure, they will all address what's called the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is basically like, well, how is it that we can have so many heinous evils that are clearly exist in the world if we also have a God that's supposed to be all-powerful and all-loving, right? Because if God is all-powerful, then God's capable of stopping the evils. And if God is all-loving, God should want to stop all the evils. Yet, evil exists. It is a very, very real problem. But you got to understand, for one thing, that argument is trying to tease apart kind of these like horns of this dilemma where like you need to modify your viewpoint on God and basically maybe suggest that God is not all-powerful, or maybe God is not all-loving. If you are willing to modify, then that argument already collapses. So, what was our initial definition for atheism? A person who does not believe in the existence of a God or any gods, plural. I just want to highlight this because that's the strongest argument that you will typically find, and it is important, but it doesn't disprove God's existence. It basically just shows that there's a flaw in the reasoning of the definition of God on these Western monotheistic viewpoints. What about polytheism? The idea that there are many gods, right? Immediately, that argument called the problem of evil can be solved in the simplest of ways. If you have two or more gods. Well, if you have two gods even, right? Some bitheism or ditheism form. Simple. One God is, and like ditheism maybe. One God is good and one is bad, right? So by having two, I can easily exonerate the one and keep them good, right? And the other one is the source of evil and things that are bad. So maybe you're like, okay, what's the point? I don't get it. The definition of atheism is they're lumping in the existence of a God, singular, like a more monotheistic, or any gods, plural. But what I'm trying to highlight is that you need different arguments to discredit or refute God singular versus God's plural, right? That's all I wanted to point out there. So you can meditate on that and we can discuss it in the comments. But I want to spend most of the rest of this episode looking at some alternative options. Right? Different forms of theism that maybe you've heard of some of them, but definitely not all of these. Let's start with some that might be a little more familiar to a few people. Deism. So on a deistic framework, you have this idea that there is a creator God that in a clockwork universe fashion sets up the laws of physics, if you will, flips a switch, turns the machine on, and then the universe just runs on its own according to the laws of physics. There are no miraculous interventions, right? So there's no like supernatural intervening, and God is fully transcendent and does not seem to really care or is not affected, right, by what happens in this universe that God created. That's deism. It was very popular in the Enlightenment era, even up through someone like Charles Darwin. I understand he went through different phases, so at times he sounds deistic, maybe even more typical Anglican or something earlier, and then maybe agnostic or atheist. But a lot of the sort of the educated elites, whether it's founding fathers, right, in America, or famous scientists, would be deists. Because it's a safer position where you still have a powerful church globally in sort of the 1700s, 1800s situation. Okay? That's deism. Next up, pantheism. Pantheism means that all things are God. Nature is God. Whatever reality or ultimate reality is, it's fully divine. Let's talk about that a little differently. In deism, you had a transcendent God, fully sort of like outside, separate from the system, right? The creation. With pantheism, whatever God is fully immanent, as in like within everything, right? Okay? So it's very distinct from a deistic framework where God's fully transcendent, outside of things. Now there are some real issues, which I'll get to here in a second, with both of these. For deism, one of the main issues would be why? Why even bother? Like, what's the point of even creating this mechanistic clockwork universe and then just leaving it to run? It's like, what do you really get out of it? For pantheism, there's a real concern of like, well, how did it ever start? Where's the creation point for all of this? You can solve those questions with a third option for us, which is going to be pandeism. Mashup. There's a lot of mashing up here. Let's take the strengths of pantheism and let's take the strengths of deism, and then we'll just push them together and we have pandeism. With pandeism, you have an answer to the question of how the universe was created, because you still have this like original creator God. But what the tweak here is this like original creator God decides to completely immerse themselves, like lose themselves, into creation. Possibly in a forgetful state, so that maybe God knows that he is, but not what he is, type of thing. Right? Unique, maybe in some versions of some of the early stories in India that you might get. You might be able to find this in some of the classical literature, but it's a good, interesting option that gives us sort of a little bit of the best of both worlds from things. So how creation even started, and then sort of like, well, what's the point? Because you're able to like go in and experience through the material world, experience divinity. Now, I'm not overly fond of those options, to be completely honest. I'm more inclined to our next option, which would be panentheism. Not pantheism, panentheism. By adding those two letters, the en, it changes everything. So instead of saying that everything is God, now you're saying that all is within God. But you can be within something, but not totally of it, in the sense of sharing the exact same nature, function, substance, or essence as something else. Right? I mean, even think of just a human body. There's a lot of different things going on that could be, quote, within us, within our psyche, whatever we really are there, our consciousness, our soul. whatever the ego kind of self is, right? That sort of controls the entirety. There are all these different types of cells, different types of functions, and it's not as if I created them per se. Right? So even right now, I'm inside of a room, maybe a poor analogy, but I'm in it, but not of it. The nature of a room might simply be to enclose and hold space, but that doesn't just fully define me and what I'm capable of. I would hope not. That's not doing too much. So with panentheism and process theology would be the best, I'd say, example of a panentheistic theology, right? But to jump back to this, you've got, again, the best of both worlds with panentheism. Here you have the idea that like God is related to a world and therefore is immanent within the world, constantly trying to persuade and influence that way rather than coerce all the other actual entities that exist, okay, and make up the universe. But there's also this like transcendent component still that is God as its own sort of actual entity. So you kind of have like that transcendent element as well, right? There's a reciprocal exchange or relationship between God and the world on this panentheistic framework, right? Now, how about a couple others? Well, if you had deism, you had pandeism. I mean, you could have polydeism. I mean, you could start making up a lot of things, right? You could have this idea where there were a bunch of different creator gods, right? Rather than just one, and all of them don't seem to care once they create the universe, their own universes, or different parts of the one universe, or something like that. So you can get really creative here if you want to. I think one that is interesting that's not discussed very frequently, you often hear it's like, all right, basically there either is a God or there is not a God. You don't really talk about it in terms of like, well, maybe there was a God, but there's not anymore. Or maybe there was not a God originally, but there will be one that emerges, right? One that comes about at a certain point on this like evolutionary process. Now, all of these are playing with different definitions of God, these alternative forms of theism that we're talking about. Almost all of these, you're not going to be able to maintain the like omnis of, again, like omnipotence, omniscience, right? But that doesn't mean that that can't still be defined as a God. Okay? We need to have a more fluid and open discussion about what are really the options for talking about like higher powers, right? To make it maybe simplified and just talking like that, a higher power. But let's jump back to this. How about emergent theism? The idea that something, there wasn't a God, maybe we're sticking strictly with more scientific principles or physicalism, materialism. But through all the different stages of evolution, we're at a point where maybe artificial intelligence, right, functions now as this kind of like, above all things, capable of really influencing all things in a way that never existed before on a planetary level, right? At least at the moment. Is that really a God or God-like, at least, possibility? So we might maybe shift between God and God-like, but it's still an intriguing possibility. So instead of just thinking like there is or there isn't, it's like, well, maybe there wasn't a God, but there's about to be one soon. Those things don't come up. Again, the point of this video is like atheism. Have you earned that title? And I'm trying to claim that the people that are part of this like new atheist movement have not, because they will not engage in this type of discussion or dialogue. And the main reason I assume that they would not want to is that they're just going to write it off as, well, that's just not what God is, and that's just not the definition, so I don't need to talk about it. Or it's numerically negligible, like Dawkins said, but that misses the whole point. It's like, if you really want to claim to be an atheist, and that there's no possibility of any type of gods, then you've got to do a lot better and be willing to engage in dialogue with people like me, or people like the person who wanted to talk about Tillich or Bonhoeffer, right? Or a open theist or a process theologian or whatever. All these various options that are out there. Like the deists, more deists, pantheists, pandeism, right? All these different things. Now, we've gone over a lot in a short period of time. Before we kind of get into like a totally different topic and wrap up the video, I want to briefly talk though about some new crazy stuff. This is stuff that you can't look up if you were to Google it. And yes, I'm throwing a lot of like Greek terms together with what you're about to hear. So it might sound a little long and ridiculous, but I guess, humor me on this. One thing is this idea of like pan-in-microtheism. So we so quickly jump from like, there's us, tiny little people on this one planet, and then God, right? That huge leap. What about all these other kind of like levels on a chain of being, maybe? Whatever happened to that intermediate type realm? So with this pan-in-microtheism, kind of saying that all things are actually within smaller, right, gods. And well, what does that mean? Maybe there's a planetary intelligence, an intellectual sphere that sort of covers the planet in some way. That has been discussed by some in the 20th century. Maybe the cosmological horizon somehow functions as a sphere or boundary, right, that can holographically store information and can be understood as somehow godlike. And all these things are within that smaller God. But there's other universes also within their respective, smaller gods. So that's an option that you don't really ever hear about. Here's one that I think's pretty intriguing, that takes us into a totally different territory. Certainly never heard anything like this discussed. I bet a lot of people listening to this have heard of dark matter, dark energy, what's called the dark sector. It really wasn't seemingly that interesting because of the fact that up until recently, the idea was that these are weakly interacting particles and that they're simple, and whatever dark matter isn't forming like complicated structures. Like, so there's not like dark atoms, dark stars, dark galaxies or whatever. But more recently, it's seeming like that could at least be a possibility. And so what I'm getting at here is that if the majority of what even like makes up our universe is not ordinary matter, but dark matter, right? Is it possible, if it's capable of interacting with itself a lot more, that there is a type of consciousness and maybe some sort of godlike entity in that darker realm? And I know it sounds again like science fiction kind of, but seriously, it's not. I'm trying to make a very serious proposition here. there very well could be some type of consciousness that is in this dark sector realm. Now, maybe it can only interact with ordinary matter, with our world, through gravity solely, right? Hence why these things are dark. It's not interacting through electromagnetism and other things. It's through gravitational interaction. But guess what? There's gravitational waves. Who knows? Maybe there's a possibility of having some level of communication via gravitational waves back and forth, and maybe there could be some sort of intelligence there. It's wildly speculative, of course, but why the hell not talk about such things? We could even give it a Greek name, panentheism, something, which would be like all inside of a dark God. Pretty guarantee you've never heard of that on any other video. And for that alone, I guess reason to make the videos, right? If I can bring up something bizarre that's at least novel for most people. All right, there you've got it. A lot of different forms of theism that I just like threw out there. And what was the point again? This video is supposed to be about atheism. And I'm trying to claim that you might think that you're an atheist, but the odds are that you're familiar with the arguments against the traditional, classical form of theism. And that's what you've got. You probably are not aware that many of those arguments, effectively all of them, fall short of discrediting something like process theology, which is panentheistic, just to give one good example where there has been some like literature on this kind of back and forth. But you won't hear about that. It's not going to make the news, and it's not going to be on some popular debate or show, right? Instead, you want to have like the intense militant atheist versus the seemingly fanatical religious person, and they just clash, and nothing comes of it, right? The whole video so far has been about God. Whether there is one, maybe there's a bunch of gods or goddesses, whatever. Maybe there aren't any. But here's a whole nother layer to this discussion that doesn't really get brought up. And that's the idea of there being other philosophical or religious ultimates. Maybe whatever ultimate reality and truth is doesn't need to be so simple or singular. Maybe we need to talk about other totally different components that make up a system that comprises ultimate reality. God might be only one piece, the piece responsible for trying to provide order or memory or something like that of a larger, much, much larger system, right? If that's the case, then there could be other valid religious or philosophical ultimates. Let me just throw out a couple for you. The forms, as in Platonic forms. Think of the notion of two-ness, right? Or redness or goodness. Right? Perhaps you do need some initial set of information or data that's there whenever ultimate reality first clicked on, so to speak. And that, whatever God is, might be using that. Certainly is going to be related. I definitely think they're going to be mutually presupposing and mutually grounding of one another if there are these different ultimates. But they should be understood as capable of being distinct. Okay? So, Platonic forms as another option. Something else from the Greek world, eros. When you think about love, we think love in terms of physical love, erotic love with people, but on a more abstract philosophical notion, eros is like the idea of bringing multiple things together into a state of oneness, right? Into a state of togetherness. So if you think of it like that, then it almost seems like we're talking about something akin to gravity on a metaphysical scale. Maybe there's God and there's other stuff, a world of other entities, always. Maybe there's always a multiplicity. And if there are, then maybe they're forced to be, pulled together almost gravitationally through this third term or something that we could understand as eros. These are just a couple notions of how there could be other religious or philosophical ultimates. Okay? And that brings us into a whole nother subject, which can address a major argument for atheists, which is called the conflicting religious truth claims. We're like, oh, well, how come, if religion was true, then don't you think there'd be more continuity and similar accounts of ultimate reality? Like, why doesn't Taoism and, Buddhism, why don't they really sound like Christianity and Islam? They sound very different. And the answer here would be they are different. It's because they're focused on different components of ultimate reality that make up a larger system, sort of thing. Right? So there's another piece to this puzzle, right? So yes, I understand that if you want to really narrow your discussion that like God equals only this, right? Only this definition of classical theism, then fine. But I really don't think it's fair if you want to do that and then write something called the God delusion. You need to call it what it is, which is, on your view at least, the delusion of Western monotheism, or the delusion of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam type of thing. So there's a lot more out there. And if you're willing to sort of broaden, your definition of what God is and kind of look at these different levels and layers of like systems and subsystems maybe, right? And if we're willing to define certain things as God-like, at the very least, it really opens up totally new avenues, new vistas for talking about these fascinating topics that have intrigued people for thousands of years, right? So with that, you know where I'm going in ending things. We should, I guess, kind of stick with something that's on the cover here and stay gray.